He said, I was thinking today about trust. Is it an independent value, such as truth, that can stand alone, or is it a dependent value that is born out of transaction? If the latter, out of the transaction part, it means that trust can only be earned, not given. It also means that it can be won or lost in transactions. It would also be wrong to, this is all he just said, all this. It would also be wrong to assume that trust exists as a given, as an ever-present value in an organization. And he says, I think this is an area that warrants your research and thinking. So many make the assumption that trust is an independent value like truth. And he said, in an organization that where it persists as given, despite the players or the process. And so he was saying, like, we can't make the assumption that it's a given. It's so, and I'm like, Dad, oh my gosh,
Dr.
you're
David McKenna.
at 95. So he lit me up today with so many of the conversations, including the one we get to have right now.
Let's get this wild conversation going. Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to have a wild conversation with Dr. Gavriel Schneider, a leader in the field of human-based risk management and the psychology of risk. Serving businesses in dozens of countries around the world, he's the CEO of Risk to Solution Group of companies, Australia's most awarded cyber and physical integrated risk business, and the creator of the concept of Presilience. I heard that his book under that name is releasing sometime soon, perhaps in the next few weeks. We'll see. He is also this amazing combo of researcher and business person as director of the postgraduate psychology of risk program at the Australian Catholic University, ACU, and a senior researcher for the Australian Security Research Centre, ASRC. I'm going to test all the listeners on that acronym after. Dr. Gav is a much sought out after international speaker and also the author of the highly acclaimed book, Can I See Your Hands? A guide to situational awareness, personal risk management, resilience, and security. And I appreciate this. He's a lifelong martial artist, holding several high grades, including a 7th degree black belt in Krav Maga and Jiu Jitsu. Dr. Gav, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sabbath and Rob. Very happy to be with both of you today.
This is gonna be great.
It's going to be an incredible conversation. And to start us off, we're going to play a quick round of wild cards. We didn't prep you for this, Gav, but we're going to dive quickly with our first response. So just go from your gut. What we have is a deck of 50 wild cards, and we use them with teams and organizations all across the world. And it's just a really fun way to get to know each other. So I have 10 randomly picked. So we'll pick a number between 1 and 10. I'll go first. You can go next, and Rob will round us out. So I'm going to pick number 4 today. What would change if you were intentionally investing in the growth and development of others?
That's a loaded question, right?
Yeah,
because it assumes that we're not investing in the growth and development of others.
Indeed.
So I'd probably say my response is, if I stopped doing that, I probably would lose the motivation for what I do. So I think fundamentally it's not would I do it, it's I can't stop doing that, because honestly my entire business ethos would implode if I stopped that.
It's who you are. It's what it sounds like.
I love it that Gav just cut into your question, Sab.
Okay.
So that's awesome.
I didn't help myself.
Sorry.
He did. That's awesome. So now you get to pick another one.
Oh, okay.
That's fair. That's fair.
I love his response. Okay. Good. Too good.
Yeah, so good. Okay, I'm going to go with 7. When you think about the people who have your back, the people who you would turn to next time you are taking a risk, who do you think of? My husband. He's the first person that came to mind. Thinks strategically and in a way that my brain doesn't. And so it's really helpful to have his different perspective. Okay, Dr. Gav, pick a number between 1 and 10.
Oh, he already went. He doesn't get to go again, does he?
I'm done.
What? Okay.
Give me
Dr.
number 2.
McKenna, go. Okay.
Look at me like I'm going to offend my new buddy. Okay, go ahead.
What would change if you knew what motivates you?
I do, because I use our platform, by the way. That's my shameless plug. And I know specifically what motivates me. I think what I'm realizing is, and we're having a conversation about this next week as a team about our motivational drivers and what's important there. And one of the things I've been thinking about is the extent to which my motivational drivers sometimes blind me to the things I need to change.
Mm,
So that's where my brain is with that question right now.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's good. That's
So
good.
Sab, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for going there.
Gav, let's jump into this conversation. So it is so good. You and I met recently, and we immediately realized there are some sibling things about us that we're separated by thousands and thousands of miles. But I was so grateful for our time together in Seattle, and for this conversation. And goodness, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the mission that you are on right now. A way I think about that is like, what is the moment that you are seizing personally and in your business?
Um, Thanks, Rob. And I loved your term about sibling type meeting there, because
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating when you meet somebody who has walked a different pathway in almost every way, yet has come to the same place.
yeah,
And it's always reassuring to see that. So to answer your question, I think that the interesting piece of where I'm at now is probably as we get to our age, call it late 40s, early 50s, we've lived a little bit, we've done some things, we've achieved some stuff. Uh, my kind of position at the moment is really focusing a lot more on the make a dollar, make a difference drive, and not necessarily separating the two, trying to really concentrate on doing the things that I feel move the needle and
huh,
perpetuate the knowledge.
huh,
I think that part, we've got to pass on what we know, and we've got to pass it in a way that makes that next generation better. And I think that's a real mission for me at the moment with the Presilience work we've done.
huh. And where is the I'm trying to think of the follow-up to that, because I was curious, the um where do you see opportunity to do that? I'm also
Interesting.
I'm also interested in the challenges of doing that, but where do you see opportunities specifically given what you have at your fingertips?
Thanks, Rob. I
Yeah.
think a few things. Let's separate some of the services and offerings we have so that your listeners understand a little bit more, sort of the duality of my answer.
Yeah.
So I started my career punching, kicking, fighting in the martial arts, grew up in South Africa, became a bodyguard, worked all over Africa, and went to a lot of interesting places. So the kind of frontline survival, keep yourself safe, protect yourself drivers were sort of my foundation. As the business side of things grew and evolved, and we ran not for profits and bought and sold businesses, expanded my current business to a mid-size. We're about 350 people, which is quite a big business in Australia, which has a very small population. But equally along the way, I think, particularly in teaching that postgrad program in the psychology of risk for so long, and I'm sure you've had the same sort of
Mhm.
epiphanies of we can get stuff, we understand stuff because we've had the time to dig into it both academically and professionally. You've had the time to tinker and play, and even your response to what motivates you. I would have been a little bit worried at your stage of evolution if you kind of went, I don't know what motivates me.
Mhm.
So the fact that you do is really important. But from my perspective, I think the challenge we've got is the world to me at the moment seems comparatively divided and stuck.
Huh.
And we're tackling these challenges of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. I mean, the US is probably the textbook example of this at the moment, with kind of binary positioning where people can't even, uh, accept the reality that your view could also be right and my view could also be right. And somewhere in the middle is probably a good place to meet. So practically, I see a few things. From a product perspective, our frontline products, which have to do with personal safety and keeping yourself safe. But the world is safer than it was many years ago and more dangerous than it was in many ways. If we
Mhm.
look at cyber risk, if we look at the frustration, the perpetuation of physical violence and aggression, which has definitely been increasing consistently post-COVID, those frontline keep yourself safe type services, keep your team safe, keep your business safe, are going to be a constant driver for us. But equally, and this is where we segue, the kind of Presilience, leadership, and high performance components, which, it's wonderful to stay safe, but staying safe doesn't mean we'll get a good outcome. It just means we'll be okay. It's wonderful to achieve great things and potentially, achieve the strategic objectives, make some profit, keep your stakeholders happy, etc. But if you do that in a way that's not sustainable, that breaks your people, then the game you're playing is not a game that's going to move the needle forward. So I feel we've got to almost tackle this ambidextrous approach of building if you think of a Maslow's hierarchy, making sure we address the bottom needs while we also focus on the upper needs. And I'm kind of feeling pretty blessed at the moment that my business evolution has given us a range of products across both domains.
That's so interesting. So one of the places for our listeners to understand that I think Gav and I connected was realizing, as he said, that we came at this from different angles. And there's an expansion happening inside of both of us over the years. And also, Gav, I told you this, that I was introduced to the entire physical security ecosystem. And I'd say human beings, these amazing, incredible human beings, the sheepdogs of the world, if you will. And with very little, with kind of an understanding of them, feeling like these were brothers and sisters I didn't know I knew yet. Like I felt like I had this, and I literally tripped into it going into the great conversation with our shared friend Ron Warman, and not even knowing I was stepping into. And I have just these deep relationships, and I'm curious. I think we can get it. I want to get into that a little bit because I have some things from your book I want to dig into from this book. But even before that, I was on a podcast on Monday, and it's a podcast that's about resilience. And so words matter to me a lot. So I think I told you that. And so I went, and I've looked at this over the years because the word gets thrown around a lot. So I looked at the definition of resilience. And I think there are a few different ways of looking at it. One of the things that I grab onto was the ability of something to be stretched and then come back to its original form quickly. And it was fascinating, right? Because I thought of a rubber band, of course, that's where my brain goes. And you think about brittleness of a rubber band. If a rubber band is brittle, and you just stretch it and it just breaks, right? As it ages or it gets weathered or whatever. And so in this concept of presilience, will you define this for us?
Okay, so there's a few interesting pieces there. I will define presilience shortly, but you addressed a very important aspect that often doesn't get brought up. So I'd like to tackle it for a second, which is the concept of elasticity as it associates with resilience and presilience. Because I think this is one of those fundamental challenges. If we look organizationally first, and then we can bring that back down to individuals, which, to your point, if I'm already as an individual tired, not feeling well, emotionally not strong, and you want me to be high performing, it's probably not going to be easy to do. Whereas if all those other pieces are in place, think of the elastic analogy you gave. It's brand new, it's field tested, it's pretty strong. It's been built in a way that enables it to have durability. It's likely going to be more reliable. So one of the fundamental challenges we found in researching the field of resilience is that resilience and reliability tend to intersect and are actually more or less the same thing. Like, I want to be resilient so that I can be reliable. And in an era that moved slower than the era we are in today, sometimes being reliable and having good market position was enough for a business to be successful. In the modern world, which we like to describe as volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and digitized, VUCAD, which, interestingly enough, noting the light-hearted kind of banter we started this off with, sometimes my people often come to me and go, man, I just got VUCAD, as a descriptor of something disrupting them and changing what they were doing. That's become a bit of a verb for us too, not just a descriptor. But we started researching the sort of intersection of risk and resilience. So risk, it hasn't happened yet. Resilience is what I need when a risk gets realized. Okay? And you speak to any risk expert, and they'll tell you that most of the time when it comes to risk management, we're accepting a level of residual risk. Like, we'll try and bring it down to a level that's tolerable, but ultimately, if we take no risk, we never achieve anything. So we also have to look at risk in a more rounded way. I ended up working with a guy by the name of Tony McGurk, who was at the time, I think, the chair of the World Fire Chiefs Association, and he had taken the worst performing fire department in the UK and turned it into the best. And we spent a lot of time exploring this sort of intersection of risk and resilience, and kept coming up with a few frustrating realities. One is systemic, and you can, any of your listeners, just think of the organization you work for. And if you're working for a larger corporate type organization that's older than 30 years, then part of the challenge you've probably got is that's built on industrial age modeling with very clear chains of command, span of control, and a lot of concepts that create great structure, but it's based on two ideas that don't necessarily hold fast in the market now. One is a high degree of control, and two is a high degree of certainty. So the challenge then comes that if I don't have a high degree of control and a high degree of certainty, I need more elasticity, right? I need to be able to stretch and be pulled and pushed. But equally, I need to move from this idea of, originally, the idea of elasticity and business continuity within the world of resilience was I get stretched because of a disruption. And during this process, it's painful and it's tough, but our systems are strong enough for us to come back to where we were very quickly. So the whole aim of those systems is get back to where you were pre-disruption as quickly as possible. What we kept asking, and COVID showed this so many times, and I think your and my career have shown this, sometimes when a tough thing happens, it creates the biggest opportunity. And if you're only thinking about coming back to the shape you were pre-disruption, then you miss the opportunity. So that was the first big gap. And the second big problem was the idea of proactive prevention. So in resilience, the idea is I need to be tough enough. The system needs to be strong enough. I need enough durability. I need enough reserves to get through whatever disruption I'm facing. It does not really contemplate, let's stop the thing from happening in the first place. And this is one of those frustrations. I think I wrote an article about this maybe 12 years ago. I called it the reactive security safety spending model, which if you work in any sort of risk domain in a business, just visualize this one for a second. We don't spend any money because we don't think something bad will happen. So we're vulnerable. Bad thing happens, we throw money at the problem. Because we throw money at the problem, we have enough resources in place to tackle the problem. Because we have enough resources in place, the problem starts to evaporate and becomes something that doesn't happen. So what do most organizations do? They strip budget away and strip budget away because nothing's happening. And eventually they get back to the point where they're vulnerable. So it becomes a cycle of pain, basically. And we can break that cycle just by changing the mindset to being a bit more proactive. So in a very long-winded way, the shift from resilience to presilience involved two things. It involved the focus on opportunity centrism and the focus on proactive prevention as a differentiator from resilience. The last point was when we kicked off the Presilience idea, which was in probably late 2017, we originally thought it was just going to be honestly defined as proactive resilience. And the more we field tested this with our clients, with my graduates, the more we actually found phonetically resilience, react, respond, recover. It straight away created this chunking effect, and any of your psychology listeners will appreciate that, of a response thing, something I wait for. And that just doesn't leave us in the position of being able to make great decisions ahead of time. You know, that old saying of sometimes, you know, when preparation and opportunity intersect, we get the best outcomes. It's probably accurate. Like you've got to be prepared and ready to be able to capitalize on the opportunity. So that's presilience. And what we have found is that actually it's a combination of three variables: compliance, the stuff I have to do; resilience, what I need when the stuff I have to do is not enough or something unexpected happens; and then we can move to the presilience piece. And if I get all three of those pieces standing correctly, and probably now that I've been looking at your work, probably with a heavy dose of trust in the middle of that, otherwise it ain't going to work, you can get high performance.
It's so interesting. So there's so much, this is where we have come at this from different angles. So you know that while the acronym is whole and intentional leader development, and my team knows, you know how it is, you build a business and you end up kind of building a business that looks a little bit like you kind of can't help it. And I always tell, my wife laughs because I am cursed with what I call strategic foresight. So I'm always preparing for the worst And but it doesn't mean I'm a person. I don't walk around in dread, but I'm always thinking about life as both being present in the moment and moving forward, but also preparing for contingencies. So and it has effect. It's been a problem at times, but it's like I'm in preparation for things that, and I would describe it as contracting sometimes, psychological contracting, but actual contracting as well. So that, and oh man, I have a place I'm going to go in this book in just a second. You're going to laugh at where my brain went when I was reading it. But is it that concept of preparation and action is so interesting to me, and so fascinating. And one thing that made me think about, Gav, when you were just talking was, um, I was on a panel a few years ago with, he was one of the most famous executive coaches in the world, David Peterson, and we had just launched the next version of the Wild Trust platform. And one of the assessed things that you profile on within it is the developmental readiness index. And so I was really excited about this, like developmental readiness. And he's on, and someone asked him from the audience, I'm sitting next to him, and they said, "So what's the future, David?" And he said, "The assessment of readiness." And so of course I'm kind of grinning inside, going like, I've got something I'm gonna say, that's gonna be fun. Because he kind of set the stage for that. And I was thinking about something that is often isn't thinking about in the risk and resilience space. Like you were like, it hasn't happened yet. And then it happens, and resilience being my typical response. But is that another part of that is that readiness is like combining those things together. And that's just the way I approached it psychologically. And go wherever you want with that. I just want to keep hearing your brain go before I get into this book, because I have something that's going to connect the dots. What does, I'm just curious from your perspective, what does trust have to do with all that?
Awesome. So to answer that in one word, which is very rare for me, everything. So here's the segue, right?
Huh.
What we found is, why bother with any of this stuff at all? Why think about risk? Why think about resilience? Why think about presilience? Why not just go with the flow and see what happens, or potentially adopt corporate stroke governmental based risk management, which I often refer to as risk theater, where they're doing all this stuff to pretend they're managing risk, but it's really about CYA, which is cover your ass, as opposed to actually make better decisions and get better outcomes. So firstly, fellow sheepdog, you make me so happy, Rob. You can't but help yourself in terms of going, I'm the one around who will make sure everything's okay for everyone else. And that's the driver that keeps your brain going. What if this happened?
Yeah.
What if that happened?
Yeah.
So you are one of the select few that actually doesn't have to be trained to do that. You can't help yourself, which is a wonderful gift. Also a bit of a curse, because, to your point, the way you brought up strategic foresight as a potential negative instead of just a positive is it can run amok, right? Like you can start really stressing about things that you cannot control, cannot influence. But anyway, to segue back to,
I can't wait for you to meet my wife, by the way, so you can normalize this conversation,
I look forward to it. But to directly answer your question around what trust has to do with this piece, if we think about it, I'd like us to think of 4 layers. And when we think of the 4 layers, for me, this is what I refer to as multi-dimensional thinking, because we live in complexity as a default now. We are no longer in a world where things are simple or just complicated. The majority of our interactions are sitting in the complexity or chaos space now. And I'd urge your listeners, if they're not familiar with, complex adaptive systems theory or any of that stuff, just Google it. You don't have to become an expert, but understanding a bit of systems theory helps you understand which skills you need for which parts of the systems.
Yeah.
But the interesting piece is that if I look at those 4 domains, domain 1 is self, right? Me. If I don't trust myself and I don't trust the way I absorb information, analyze that information, make a decision, act on that decision, learn from my action and adjust accordingly, I can't get high performance. So if I can't get high performance, either I'm the one on the team pulling everyone down, or I'm going to start to dislike myself and not back myself, which means you're never going to be a very good high achiever. And you're arguably not going to live the life that you could. The next domain then is others. So once I can develop that self-awareness, the confidence and the trust in my own thought processes, decision-making, critical thinking, etc., I can do that with others, which is where the leadership followership domain comes in. And, you've spent decades researching this stuff, but practically you will not get a high performing team or group of people without trust. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And, to that point, how you started this podcast, I want to meet your dad. He sounds like a really cool guy.
Yeah.
But practically I would have said to your father, based on what he said, to me, trust is both. Like it's both it's both an innate thing that people could have, but equally it's a transactional aspect that could be destroyed or created very quickly based on your actions or others. So knowing that it could be both potentially, I need to arrive resilient, right? I need to arrive as a package that is trustworthy. But equally, then I've got to work to gain your trust, hold your trust, and maintain your trust as you should with mine. Otherwise, we're not going to get a high-performing team.
Yeah.
As per a lot of your research, you've obviously found that great leaders are able to do this almost naturally, and they have this ability to become the oil and glue. They lubricate the system and they hold it together, which is the next shift then, which is thinking organizationally. And I think we're in an era now, mainly because of the internet and the fact that we can share information with each other live time anywhere in the world, is that organizations are changing. And it's incredibly hard for those who are only focusing on, let's call it transactional type metrics or transactional type interactions. Fundamentally, they're not sustainable because they're based only on the concept that you put enough value to spend X amount of money with me for something I'm providing. So the second somebody comes up with a cheaper option or a slightly better option, there's no loyalty there.
Right.
So trust and loyalty from an organizational perspective are so important. And I'll share a quick anecdote on that.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
Our corporate statement that I like all of my people to hinge to is protecting what counts. Okay, that's the vision mission statement of our group. And maybe 8-9 years ago, on one of our offsites, when we were a lot smaller, I think there were only 10 or 12 of us on that one. One of my colleagues who worked for me then said to me, Gav, we protect what counts, but we're only looking at it from what the client wants. What about us? What about the people who work in this business? Don't we count?
Yeah.
And it really shifted my view, going, absolutely. And arguably, my people count more than my clients because I can always get a new client. I can't necessarily get a new staff member that understands what we do, why we do it, buys into our vision, etc.
Yeah.
So the idea of getting these layers aligned is really important. And then the fourth layer being societal. So I think we're at an all-time low with societal trust. If you look at our leadership, if you look at the way decisions are made, and it's like a chicken or egg discussion. Are we in this position because trust is eroded, which has created poor leadership, or have we got poor leadership, which has eroded trust?
Yeah.
Either which way, if the way to start changing it is to look at yourself first.
Yep.
And to kind of close off on this piece, a few years ago, I was on a panel during COVID for the Institute of Strategic Risk Management, which I've been involved with for a long time. And they had these really smart experts. There was an astrophysicist, an expert in urban resilience, a cyber expert, and almost all these experts had doom and gloom stories. We're working from home now in COVID. We're set for a solar flare that'll take out the satellite network. So everybody's sort of sitting there going, we're hanging on by a thread. It's going to go. Then you had these large-scale urban resilience experts explaining very factually why we've built all our cities wrong and how they're not going to cope with expansion into the future. And similar pieces with the internet side of it. We've built this thing wrong. It's not secure by design. So we're in trouble now. And my view was totally opposite to that, going, hold on a second. There's all these problems, but equally, most of these problems have occurred because humans are really awesome and build cool stuff.
Yeah.
right? Which means we can solve these problems too, but we're not going to solve them by going, this problem is so big, it's overwhelming us. We're going to solve these by building people who understand themselves, understand others, understand an organization, are purpose driven, as per how you started this discussion, and align on that purpose. Then we'll start to see changes that are more sustainable. And I'm not just talking environment. We too often think of climate environment as the only linkages to sustainability. But I look at it from people like you and I. How do we keep going? If what we do is not sustainable, how do we pass the knowledge on? How do we perpetuate that knowledge? How do we make it better? And
Yeah.
arguably, if we both employ people, if we can't do that, how do we keep our people fed, happy, healthy, and growing? And
Yeah.
then how do they contribute? So
Yeah.
long story, short story, one of the things I've loved about your stuff so far, Rob, is that you put trust, which for me has always been, one of those variables that you have to have it, but we haven't necessarily focused on how to get it, how to build it, how to measure it. So I love the fact that you've done that, and that perfectly fits in with what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So let me explain something for our listeners before I ask you this other question. I want us to get into something in your book. I hope that I'm thinking about a few of the organizations and the CEOs that we work with, and to translate some of the things. I don't even know if I have to, but what Gav said is that the concept of like risk and resilience, which in the security industry is not news at all. I hope that you relate to that, whether I'm thinking of one person, who runs a tech firm, another person who runs a cybersecurity firm, another person who runs a farming equipment company, another person who runs a plumbing equipment company. If I go down the list of these friends of mine who run these businesses that we have an opportunity to work with, where all that risk and resilience thing is really important. And the reason why, when I started understanding the security industry, one of the reasons that it became so salient to me was because you're talking about people where they're dealing with life and death situations daily. And so they take all the things that some of us think might happen and say, I've got to be ready for that happening now. And not to live in fear, but that concept of being ready it's the job. And it actually probably should be all of our job. Presilience should be all of our job. And one other thing, Gab, that you mentioned that I'm restating what you said in my own way, is that the wild statement is, we always say our focus is on the one with an eye to the many. And that change always begins within the one. It begins within the individual, within the psychology, the thinking, the behavior, the feelings, the drive and motivations of the individual. And we oftentimes we scale quickly. So even in what Gav was saying, we can take that to sort of an abstract organizational level too quickly and realize that all of that resilience begins within the psychology of a person. And what Gav was just saying, and I'm just saying what you said, but in my own way, is that when that change, and it takes, we don't get trust or presilience, I would assume in your language, by talking about just that. We get trust by doing the things that we know from decades of research actually build those things that build trust. We don't, it's like, you don't get people communicating because you tell them you have an open door policy. You don't get people to trust each other by saying everyone here should trust each other. That's just not a thing. But I become trustworthy when I understand my motivations, going back to the beginning. I become trustworthy when I understand my competencies and lack of. And I get honest with other people. It starts to shift things at the team level. And that there are things at the organizational level that begin to build trust as well, is my way of translating, not translating, because Gav, some of you are like, Rob, shut up, because Gav made complete sense. And so Gav, related to that, let me read something from this book that you blew my mind. Okay. And I hope this isn't a stretch. I think you'll be like, exactly, Rob, you're just using different language. But this is in your chapter on working out what to do. Now, keep in mind, listeners, that this is Can I See Your Hands? A Guide to Situational Awareness, Personal Risk Management, Resilience, and Security. And in this particular chapter, we're getting towards, so what do you do about all this? And Dr. Gav says something right here that was pretty powerful for me to understand. And Gav, just hold on for a second, because you're going to want to jump on this. He's talking about criminals, but I'm going to translate this to trust very quickly. He says, most criminals choose their target based on what they might get out of it. Okay, so think about this. This is someone who understands criminology. Based on what they might get out of it, and I see you, Gav, you're looking for this quote in your book. You're like, I'd be like digging away. So that's the first variable. So it's like a how much, what's the value of this thing? Do I want it or want to do this bad enough? And then the second thing, this is big, combined with the likelihood of them successfully perpetrating their crime. In other words, not getting caught. And what's fascinating about that we don't want to talk about sometimes, I did a study, my first publication with a professor. I was so excited because we were doing a study in the state of California on the deterrence to drinking and driving behaviors. So what is it that stops? But it was a gender study. So we were looking at the differences between men and women and them not drinking and driving. And what we found was fascinating, that most men, so this is not all, but most men tend to not drink and drive if they think they'll get caught. And so public policy was, if you wanted to stop men from drinking and driving, the more they felt like there was prevalence of law enforcement on the road, the less likely they were to commit crimes on the road. What was fascinating, Gav, is for women, it was different. It was whether or not they thought it was morally wrong. So if you can imagine, public policy or even billboards would look different for those two groups. So let me get to my point. That's a long, I just was so excited about this, Gav, as I was reading this. And then you go on to say, and I underlined this. Let me get to the page. You said,
Well, Rob, I'm just happy that you've actually read the book, man.
oh,
That's
dude,
awesome. Thank you.
yeah, it's like, I know. And so I want people to read this. Like, there's so many things that will translate to your business, even though you think, oh, this is about security. This is about resilience for all of us. So it says a more achievable goal may simply be to make you, your workplace, your family, and your home hard targets so that an attacker would prefer to pick on somebody else. And what Gav's saying is that it's important that what stops crime, the second variable, is the extent to which someone perceives your workplace or your home as a hard or soft target. It doesn't even, here's the thing, Gav, that I was reading, that it's a reality, but it's also a perception. So the more they perceive it's a hard target, the less likely they are to break into your house. And here's what I thought, Gav, and then I'll stop, is this. I thought, you know what he's saying, that is what Wild Leaders is doing every day, is to make distrust a hard target.
I like that a lot. That should be a bumper sticker or a put on a t-shirt.
Do you know what I'm saying? And it combines
that's
presilience, like to make distrust a hard target.
That's really cool. And I think there's a few segues to that. So a couple of thoughts quickly, Rob. First piece is, yes, 100%. Understanding criminology is incredibly useful for understanding human motivation. And I think that's one of those pieces, so often we don't want to think like people who would do bad stuff because it makes moral and ethical people feel uncomfortable. But realistically, if we look at all the research, and I know you've done a lot of this too, almost every human lies and cheats just a little, but we do it just enough so we still feel like we're a good person. And we all have these different tolerances and appetites for when we do it, how we do it. We also know that very often it's the narrative that people spin themselves or each other, or usually a bit of both, that makes them feel confident that their actions are justified one way or another. So interestingly, starting my career looking at people who wanted to hurt other people and trying to understand the drivers of why people did that and why they would do that has led to almost a lifelong journey for me to try and understand decision making and the drivers for decision making. And that's kind of led to a foundational piece of the whole Presilience package, which we refer to as risk intelligence. Now, the idea of risk intelligence, I came up with a definition because I couldn't find one that I liked, much like you did with trust. There were lots of definitions about it, but most of them had to do with big data analysis or interpreting data in a certain way to make an informed decision, which is part of the risk intelligence process. But I think it's a lot more like, we want to hire people with great IQ. We want to hire smart people that have capability. We also want to hire people with great EQ, that get along well with others, understand themselves, can socially calibrate, etc. You'll get these humans who have great IQ, great EQ, but make terrible decisions. So for me, it was the RIQ, the risk intelligence quotient, in the middle of that had to be defined and brought forward. So we started with risk intelligence before Presilience. We actually thought that would be enough. But realistically, what we actually found is that Presilience is the mindset, the attitude, and the approach. Risk intelligence is actually the skill set, the things I actually have to do to achieve Presilience.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you need both. To get a Presilience outcome, I have to be risk intelligent. To understand how to do that, we actually have to look at two simple variables. What could help me or what could hurt me if I want to achieve something? And what's fascinating, looking at the world of threat and risk as the first lens that I looked at this, combined with running businesses where you literally are doing that all the time, right? A good CEO, a good leader is constantly going, what could help me? What could hurt me? What do I do about those? Then there's a differing in strategy where some people will, ignore their weaknesses, buff up their strengths. Others will try and tackle both. There's lots of different strategies for that. But practically and foundationally, we assume that these skills are things we all have. And I think to your point with trust and all the research you've done with that, simply assuming that we have the ingredients in place to build trust is flawed, as is simply assuming that we have all the ingredients in place to be good at making good decisions. Like they have to be built, they have to be developed, they have to be primed, they have to be honed, they have to be nurtured. And many times, with risk intelligence initially, we actually looked at it and went, there are two foundational pieces if you want it to work. First is agility, which goes back to our earlier discussion around elasticity. To thrive in a VUCAD, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and digital world, I need to be able to change my views based on new information or changing variables around me. So I can't be stuck. That's why if you work in an organization that's arguably older than 30 years, is older than 30 years, arguably you're going to be stuck in an organization that is very hard to move, very hard to change, and often puts their policy and process frameworks ahead of their outcomes and their people. If you work in a brand new startup, you might not have any of that baggage, but you don't have any foundation or structure to build on. So it makes scalability very hard. What we actually need is the ability to move, to go currently for this environment, I need something more rigid. Now I need something more flexible. And we need to create structures that can do that. The second piece, which we spent a lot of time talking about, is actually just out and out resilience. If I want to be good at decision making, I have to accept the fact that I might make bad decisions, or even a good decision might take time, effort, energy, resources, and hardship to implement. So we can't just think that risk intelligence is an abstract idea. It's got to lead to action or inaction. And when I say inaction, I talk about mindful inaction, not just freezing or panicking. I choose to not do something because I've got more time to analyze, or I'm in the luxurious position of not having to do anything right now, as opposed to what we see most leaders do around us, which is freeze or panic or lie their way out of a hard situation, which, to your point, just erodes trust, which means nothing will work long term.
Yeah, that's amazing. And one thing, Gav, I also think that's I love what you just described, because you basically said this. I use this term, people ask me like, what is the number one characteristic you would look for in a leader? And a word I use is editability, the willingness to have, I kind of made up a word because it's the willingness to have the backspace key hit on things that even may feel like they're a part of your character. And so one of the qualifications for us to work with an organization is that the most senior leader in that part of the organization is going to participate. And it's not for modeling's sake, where it's like, oh, it's because you want me to model development. No, because quite frankly, you're going to be the most important change factor in that movement to change. And people understand that, but it's that willingness to say this is going to be hard, because development is change and change is hard. And a leader who doesn't see that. And so when you were talking about that, and I think one of the things that people have heard from me is that people who would say like, and they have to be careful about this. I heard I was on a podcast the other day and they said, so I've got the wrong people on the bus. And I said, maybe, but maybe you've got the wrong bus. And my point was that we have not done a good job of inviting people to get ready. We don't do that very well. And so to build our whole methodology is around a better invitation, because You cannot believe some of the most resistant people in the organizations we serve have become what now they see as their high potentials. You know what I mean? By changing the nature of the bus.
I have to insert there for a second, Rob, because I'm giving you like a virtual hug across the continent.
Yeah, yeah.
Mainly because you hit something that's so critically important, and we've learned this ourselves too the hard way. So in about 2017, 2018, once I kind of got the psychology of risk program working well, we actually started rolling out risk culture and culture change as a service. And I'd have my behavioral scientists go in, measure where they were at. We'd look at what the risk appetite tolerance was. We'd look at where the organization wanted to go from its strategy, and then we'd build a plan. And most of it had to do with building the capability blocks, as you defined,
Yeah.
getting a better bus.
Yeah.
And then refining the system, maybe making sure that, it had new tires and some good and fueled up and was clean and workable. But to your point, the ones that didn't work were always the ones where the leader was not 100% behind the project, leading the project and pushing the project, or where there were changes in the executive leadership team midway through the project.
Yeah.
To the point, we've actually gone, we don't do culture change anymore. We facilitate the requirements for you to do culture change for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big epiphany. And I think you nailed that one too, when you look at the idea of editability.
Yeah.
And this conversation, I'm like, I wish I could go back and change some other stuff in my new book, because that's perfect. Like I've got a section on coachability, and I'm like, editability is even better.
Dude,
Version 2, Rob.
We're going to write so much together. We got lots of time. Well, hopefully we got some time. So I am so grateful for this conversation, Gav, and just to be in this together. I can't wait for people to be able to hear this. So Sab, what do you got? What do you have for us now?
Yeah, thank you so much. As you mentioned, there will be more conversations to follow, and we're really looking forward to that. But we want to make sure that everybody who's listening, Gav, knows how they can connect with you. So what is the best way for them to find you and connect with you, and then the work that you're doing at Risk to Solution?
Perfect. So the easiest place to get hold of me is on LinkedIn. And I think I'm the only Dr. Gav Schneider at this stage with my background there. So you should be able to find me. If you're interested in what we're doing with Presilience, feel free to check out presilience.edu.au, which is the Institute of Presilience, and it covers the programs we run there. And our business, Risk to Solution, is literally risktosolution.com with the letter 2 in the middle, and that covers all the other service lines that we run.
Outstanding.
And we have one last wild question for you. Gav, are you in a season of accepting yourself or changing yourself?
That's such a cool question. And I often talk to my students, you're getting to know me, I'll answer a question with more questions. Yeah. But I was actually chatting to one of my students the other day, and we were talking about their own growth. And I kind of landed up sharing with them that I find I go in cycles where I'm in these cycles of intense learning, where all I want to do is lock myself in a room and learn. And then I'm in cycles of intense giving, where I just want to teach and educate. I'm in a weird cycle at the moment where I'm probably doing a bit of both, which is quite rare for me. And normally it's a bit of one or the other, but there's a good balance at the moment of, even discussions like this. Like I'm learning so much from people like Rob that I can't but open the learning mode. But equally, we're at the point now where I'd say after 7 or 8 years of starting to get this idea of Presilience out there, it's starting to be understood, accepted, and a lot of people want to know what we're talking about. So there's a nice requirement to be sharing and educating as well.
Outstanding.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we will continue this conversation.
Thank you both. And thank you to your listeners. These sort of things only work when people want to listen to people like us.
That's right.
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org. Click on the Wild Trust platform and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.